Hello, everyone. Welcome to CMN's Limelight. Limelight is an interactive platform where we interact with artists, performers, scholars, and various other skilled, talented, erudite, and dignified individuals to take a moment to understand and expand our knowledge regarding their professions. It enables us as an audience to not only gain awareness about these occupations, but also helps us decide whether it is a stream or passion that we ourselves would like to take a deeper look into. Most of us see the world through one lens, but upon the interaction with our guests, we get to understand and possibly resonate with various perspectives concerning different cultures, ethnicities, communities, and standpoints in our society. Today, we have with us artist, researcher in intermedia and site-specific performance, and an associate professor of the theater and performance at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Professor Andrew Hughes. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining me today on Limelight.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to your program.
Absolutely. So how have you been? How's the pandemic doing for you?
Well, I'm in my basement here in Kitchener, generally living online. I'm very lucky. I have a job at the University of Waterloo that keeps me able to keep my work going online, and that's been sometimes disappointing, sometimes revelatory, sometimes surprising in the way that it's played out. It's been a tricky year. I've lost track of time. My sense of time seems to be out of whack.
Right.
I've done everything I can to connect with people through digital devices, but as someone who practices a live art form, theater and performance, it's been tricky for me not to be sharing space with people, doing the work I love to do. So I think I'm similar to everybody. I'm sort of fed up with being locked down, and I'm dying to get out of my basement and go and play and work and educate in interesting spaces doing performance.
Right.
That's where
I completely agree. Yeah, we're all in the same boat.
Totally.
So, how did you come to discover your passion to be both an artist and intermedia researcher and site-specific performance?
Yeah, so my road began. I'll go way back. So in high school, I was a promising athlete, and I worked very, very hard at a training. I was really interested in running and skiing, swimming. I was a triathlete. I did cycling, swimming. Spent a lot of time doing that. I got injured back in when Ontario had grade 13. I got injured at the end of my grade 12 year. So my big year at the end of high school was altered because of injuries. And I had a really excellent theater teacher in my high school in Don Mills, George S. Henry Secondary School, by the name of Philip Stanbury. And he recognized in me someone who had discipline and dedication. And I did enjoy theater. And he mentored me and helped me along and got me to kind of become interested in this art form that he taught. And then I took a year off because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do at university. And I took a year off in part because I had a feeling I was going to go into aeronautical engineering. I was really interested in flying. I was really interested in designing and that. And I spent a lot of time thinking, and I did different kinds of tests that one does at that time to figure out aptitudes. And I was really worried about where I was going next. And then by default, I went into a liberal arts program at the University of Guelph. And I was pretty sure that my aptitude had to do with working with people. So I was focused on sociology. And then theater kind of snuck up on me again because I did take a theater course. I thought, well, I did quite well in that in high school. Why not? And then I slowly discovered in my undergrad doing sociology and theater that what the questions I had about humans, questions I had about people and relationships were being better addressed in theater than in sociology. So I shifted my focus towards theater. But then I have to say, Thara, at that point, my concern about theater was I didn't feel like I belonged really in the theater. I felt like theater was really, I've used this word before in a video I did for the University of Waterloo, a kind of a ghetto. It seemed to include a specific group of people who were drama-ramas, who were like, you know, they all loved musicals, they all loved singing and dancing and acting. I definitely wasn't one of those people. And so what I was kind of interested in, because of just finding these journals at the McLaughlin Library at the University of Guelph, I was interested in performance art. Because I found a journal called the TDR that used to be called the Tulane Drama Review. It's based in NYU. It focused on performance studies. And I started to get really interested in that. And I really thought what they were doing in that work with their bodies, with words, with space, what they were doing with action really appealed to me. And that captured me. And I really thought, I'm interested in theater, but I've got a love-hate relationship with theater. I want to practice theater, but I'm interested in where the boundaries are. I'm interested in where the limits are to the way it's conventionally practiced. And so finishing my undergrad, I was determined to go to NYU, which is where the TDR is based and where I was starting to learn about performance studies. But instead, I met the person who became my wife, my partner, and she and I decided we'd rather go to the University of Alberta in Edmonton. So like really like a left-hand turn from going to New York City. I went to Edmonton. And the great thing about Edmonton was it was a really interesting, I was in a master's program that I was allowed to really explore practice as well as a scholarship. And I was interested in directing. And they were doing a lot of work that they, in those days, called popular theater, which is now more broadly known as applied theater, where theater is used in various ways to animate community. So there I was getting this kind of affirmation of moving out of theater spaces into communities, helping communities animate their concerns, their issues. I worked with single parents. I worked with Indigenous youth on the streets. I worked with the homeless. I started seeing how theater could be this really important tool for animating community, animating identity, animating people's voices who otherwise weren't heard in other ways. And so that captured my imagination. But at the same time, I was also really interested in theater practitioners who were doing experimental, bizarre things with language, with space, with action. So I was drawn towards European practitioners who were doing that. And yeah, so at the end of my master's degree, I had sort of this, I had this complicated amalgam of experience and ideas about what I wanted to do. I went to the UK to do a Ph.D. because I knew I wanted to develop more theoretical understanding of language, of identity, of what, you know, I was concerned with at the time was postmodernity, right? Okay. So what happens with this kind of modernizing project in theater production when it reaches the points where it cracks and bifurcates, or it goes into different directions. And that's where I started through my PhD working with site-specific practitioners, working with companies that worked a lot with the body in interesting ways. So I developed in that thesis a sort of postmodern dramaturgy. And site work really connected with me because going way back in my life, I think I always have had this kind of spatial ontology, or like my sense of being is really connected to environments and space. And that goes back to the testing I had at the end of high school, where in a way I was being nudged towards architecture. I guess I have a unique sort of spatial appreciation. So yeah, so I just got what these practitioners I was working with in the UK. There's a company called Brith Gof, based in Wales. Brith Gof in Welsh means faint recollection. And what they were focused on to justify that name was the faint recollection of Welsh culture that is embedded in place. And that's part of Welsh culture that wasn't destroyed during English colonization. And, you know, this is back in the 90s, like way before conversations that we're having now about post-colonial or, you know, how do we deal with colonization, right? In relationship to Indigenous people and so on. But I was fascinated by that because I think coming from Canada, I just really appreciated the tension around the colonial project, you know, England coming to Canada, right? I appreciated I was a colonial subject, right? And so I got really excited about working in site-specific practice through Brith Gof, Mike Pearson, a guy called Cliff McLucas. Mike Pearson was a physical theater performer. Cliff McLucas was an architect, and the two combined to make that company. And then what I learned in my PhD, working with Brith Gof, working with Forced Entertainment, working with a company called Deviate in London, I brought back to Canada. And you know, and then I started working out in the prairies, and then eventually ended up back in Ontario. So that's a long answer to your question.
No problem. That's a journey. It was a journey, and I can clearly see that it's a great answer, even if it's long.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Absolutely. What challenges or obstacles did you have to overcome in following the path to a profession in intermedia and theater?
Yeah, that's a great question. Along the way, there is always challenges of how do you support yourself? How do you find ways to fund the process of following your passion, whether that's education or whether that's or artistic? So throughout my education and throughout really my career, I've always sort of found ways to keep up side gigs, to keep up jobs that I was doing alongside my studies. So as an example, my first year of doing a PhD in the UK, I was waiting for funding. I was hoping to get funding from a thing called the Commonwealth Scholarship.
Oh, okay.
And while I was doing that, I washed dishes at the Darwin College kitchen at the University of Kent, which was my college. So I was a pot wash, that they call that in England. I was a janitor in a local high school, and then I was I delivered milk. I was a milkman, or a milko, as they called you in Kent. Oi, milko. That's what they say when they're, you know, they deliver milk in the UK in these glass bottles. So I was the guy who had what's called a milk float, and you know, you'd stack all the plastic cartons with all those glass bottles in it, and I would start my shift at about 1 a.m. and finish at about 9 a.m. and then you know, I would sleep for a while, and then I would go to the university and go to the library and try and stay awake and do my research. So I guess I'm just sort of mapping out that I've tried my best to be really flexible about the kind of jobs that I see myself doing.
Yeah.
And those jobs have been really enriching for me because I've met a lot of really interesting people. So I sort of go back to the fact that I was interested in people back at the beginning, interacting with them. You know, you interact with people when you're a janitor in a very different way than you do when you're a professor. You interact with people when you're a milkman, meeting them at 2 a.m. And in the UK, you would often run into guys that were drunk coming home from the pub who just want to buy a bottle of milk from you, or sometimes steal a bottle of milk from you. So you know, you sort of find yourself going into these interesting interactions.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I guess the other struggles have always been, you know, I wanted to pursue education. I decided that I wanted to not just be a practitioner, but that I was really interested in education. I think part of my concern about that was really I was finding that education was really addressing questions and concerns that I had about practice that weren't being addressed so much in the profession. So that's always meant I've had to try to find a way to hustle to impress institutions that I would be a good teacher. I've tried to learn how to become a good teacher. I've tried to learn enough about my discipline that I can teach in different areas beyond those areas that I have a research expertise in. Oh, and yeah, maybe the other thing I'll say is this: when I came back to Canada from the UK, you know, I grew up in Toronto. I was born in Montreal. I've lived in these kind of major sort of urban areas. But I wasn't afraid to go to Lloydminster, Alberta, which is where I began my post-university career at a place called Lakeland College. And, you know, I was able to get that job in part because there was a lot of newly graduated Ph.D. students or scholars coming out of the University of Toronto or coming out of UBC. Those are the kind of two major PhD programs in Canada that looked down their nose at going to Lloydminster, Alberta. So they weren't willing to travel out to the middle of nowhere in the prairies, and I did, and I'll never ever regret that because it's really easy to judge these places as being backward or, you know, totally unhip or, you know, completely like, why would you want to go to a place where their, you know, main focus is rodeo and hockey and try and create theater? Well, because I think that's an interesting challenge. And what I found when I went there is that there was all kinds of really interesting people who were creating in that community, people I could have dialogues with, people I could work with. And we ended up creating performances that were not typical, you know, musical theater or typical Samuel French catalog plays. We ended up doing a lot of really interesting work there, and I'm very proud of that. And then I went to Regina when also a lot of people maybe weren't so keen to go there. Regina gets a bit of a bad rap in the province of Saskatchewan and elsewhere as being, you know, maybe kind of a dull city. And I really enjoyed working there, and there was great opportunity. I came to Waterloo really because there was a really good job here for me. So I came to Waterloo for that. But anyway, so I would say obstacles sometimes are about where you think you belong or where you think your comfort levels are, and obstacles that I've overcome, I think maybe have to do with, you know, I've got a master's degree. There's no way I'm going to mop a floor in a high school, or I've got a master's degree. I won't be washing dishes at my university college kitchen. It's like, well, you know, like maybe you should try that. Maybe there's something to learn there. So yeah.
I totally agree with what you said. I think, you know, once we attain a certain level in our profession, whether that's like a bachelor's, a master's, PhD, doctorate, we kind of think, you know, why would you go do a menial job? Why would we want to do that? I did this, so I do that. But then, like you said, different people, different places, different circumstance. It's just good to gain all that experience, and that's awesome. The hustles were so diverse for you. That's awesome.
Yeah, and you know, really, I think that the thing I would encourage anyone here listening to this broadcast to consider is, you know, if you're in Canada, Canada is an incredibly diverse place. Every province, every region within provinces are really, really different. We're not homogeneous at all. And I think, especially if you're used to Southern Ontario, if you're used to Toronto, if you're used to, you know, the area that we're in now, go out west, go east, go spend some time in Quebec. They're all very, very different, and I think that's a really enriching experience to go and spend some time there.
Right, I agree, definitely. And can you expand on what intermedia and all the areas of your profession entail?
Yeah, so So site, I'll begin. Okay, I'll begin with site specific, just because the intermediate for me tends to follow from that. So
Okay.
site specific theater or performance is the creation of, okay, so performance is the sort of generic term. Performance can be a variety of things. It could be what we do in theater, the actions of theater.
Right.
But performance and performance studies also looks at performance in various contexts. Could be religious, could be other sort of cultural activities, could be people's performance in work, right? Like the idea of performance is really broad. And that's useful for a way of looking at theater because it kind of uncouples you from particular sort of cultural lenses of understanding what theater is. And if you look at the origins of theater globally, usually there's a connection to religious ritual or certainly ritual. So theater really is about beginning with a kind of myth, a kind of a story, and a way of living the story through ritual. So that's kind of theater, and it has all sorts of interesting connections with performance if you want to think about the effects of action, right? And so site-specific performance is really where you are thinking about an environment, a place, a space, I should say. And those words are kind of particular in my discipline. Space is really any kind of environment you could think of. Could be a street, could be a building, an institutional building, say a hospital or a university or a government building. A historical building could be that. Could be a wide open body of land. So those are various spaces. And then when we start to articulate space, we're doing what's called placemaking. So through the writing, through the action, through the music, through the video, through the different kind of ways of animating, we are taking the space and we are making it significant in some way, which is to say we are turning it into a place. And so placemaking is really about human connection to spaces. And site-specific performance is really just doing that. And you begin with a space, which sometimes we refer to as a host, and then you start to animate it in various ways. Start to think about why that space is significant to you and your collaborators, and that can be a variety of different practices. It might be about you following a certain fine art practice. It might be about you following certain sonic or acoustic practices if you're making music, sounding and so on. It might be about you creating imagery if your orientation is fine art. Or if you're a theater person, it might be about you talking to people who work there, who live there, who call that space home. And you're gathering all this information. And it could be people's stories, it could be their dreams, it could be their desires, any way in which the space affects them and makes them excited or sufficiently inspired to reveal things to you. These become the material of the performance. So in the same way in theater, we begin with a play script and we take it from the page to the stage. In site-specific work, you are taking the space and you are animating it in various ways, using theater, using dance, using video, using music, using, all these different mediums. You are basically connecting a kind of fabrication, artistic fabrication with the found, which is the host, or, and the host and the way that you animate it sometimes becomes like the way you haunt it. So you become like the ghosts of the host. And then the third part to this is the witness or the audience. And it's crucial that the witness has an active role in piecing together the found and the fabricated, what was there in the place and how it's been animated through these various artistic media, and they become the kind of final arbiters of what the meaning of the work is. And in my work, what I really appreciate is individuals can find different meaning in different combinations and connections and experiences of the way the fabricated and the found have been put together. And that happens because usually the work that I create allows the witness or the audience member to kind of move around the environment and engage with it in multiple ways, and be part of and immersed in an experience in various ways, so that meaning can happen in all kinds of ways. And I love that kind of thing. So from that sort of practice, the site-specific performance creation or multimedia art creation, you get the intermedia. And the intermedia for me is where these different disciplines, dance, theater, video, music, they become part of the weave. They weave together in the animation or the fabrication of the found, right? And in that way, because they do different kinds of work of animating, right? They do different ways. Like music is a different way of animating or responding to the found or the sight than video or fine art practices, whatever they might be, and theater. And becomes a kind of interesting, maybe a tension or a sort of maybe even a paradox from one medium to the other. And to me, what that creates for the witness, for the audience, is this very real experience about how places are complicated, right? So you may have an experience, Thara, of a school that you once attended. Right. That would be very different than my experience because I didn't go to school there. I see it and feel it and experience it in a different way than you might have, having once been a student there. And again, the work that I create looks for these kind of different registers of response. Okay. And I really like collaborating with different people in the work that I make because I really value those kind of differences, right? Right. I like that multiplicity of response.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's like, about like multiculturalism, getting used to everything,
Yeah, I would take that even further to that it's actually interculturalism. Oh. Because I think what starts to happen with interculturalism is there's tensions between interpretations that are acknowledged, that they're actually highlighted in the work. I'm interested in that. So I'm not trying to create a harmonious kind of thing. In the work, I'm actually also quite interested in the tensions and antagonisms that exist because I think that's really real.
Right. I think you can't negate that. If that's there, you got to sort of bring it to light, make it a bit more interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So for an example, I'll just use a quick one. And I think you know about this project, the Weyburn Project.
Yes, absolutely, I do.
Which was a site-specific performance that happened at the former Saskatchewan Mental Hospital in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. Right. So there was a site that had a history that was both like a horror story, like a history similar to any kind of notorious site of history, a Holocaust encampment or something horrible like that. But it also had a history that contained, kind of remarkable scientific discovery and the birth of public health in Canada. So that project was about how do we keep that full array of meaning of what the site is, of what it is as a place. How do we keep that full array of meaning alive in the work? And that was a challenge to do.
Right. Right. I think in my memories too, the Weyburn Project was one of those it had like one of those two contrasting sides. Like you said, you saw a horror story side of it, but at the same time, you saw the meaningful, heartwarming sides of it too. It's a very unique combination, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. So when I first visited that site, and so you can imagine this was a mental hospital built in 1921. Right. And in those days, they built mental hospitals to be these massive spaces of containment of people who were deemed in the laws of that time to be mentally unwell. And in Saskatchewan, there was horrific laws with names like the Social Hygiene Act, which was essentially a law that allowed people with power to incarcerate those who they felt were unusual enough, whatever that means, right? Like unwell enough to be held in this place. So there was that alongside pretty like world-renowned psychologists working with psychotropic drugs, for example, trying to understand schizophrenia. And it's the place where the word psychedelia was defined because of the kind of work that they were doing with LSD and LSD treatment. And it's where Tommy Douglas, who was the MP from Souris Valley and later the leader of the NDP party in Canada, it's where he developed the blueprint for our Public Health Care Act in the mid 20th century. So there was good things that happened, and then there were these lamentable, kind of incarceration events that are troubling. And so, in a way, these buildings were developed to be kind of like spaces of utopia. How do we create a space that will take care of all of the mentally unwell people in the province? There's a real sort of utopia idea in that. And what our performance does in looking at the history, the architecture, the culture, the politics, the economics of that space and its legacy is exploring what I would call a sort of heterotopia, which is a space that's actually full of tension, visions, nightmares, alongside nightmares, like tons of paradox that's going on, and tensions and complications that I think are closer to human experience than the dream of the utopia.
Right. It is. It's a whole lot of stuff. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's complicated, but to me, that's one of the reasons for leaving theaters. Is in a way you can create this event that has a lot of theater in it, but it's not a purpose-built space that people are used to going and seeing the next amazing drama, right? Like if you think of any theater where you live, so I'll mention one, the Conrad Center in Kitchener. I know that building. I've been in that building to see a variety of different great performances. Right. But I'm sufficiently familiar with it that I can go in there, kind of like going into my home. And in my home, I kind of feel like, well, I can just nod off because I'm in the comfort of my own home. And when I was a master's student reviewing plays in the different theaters in Edmonton, I was so underslept trying to get my work done that I would often fall asleep during performances, even if they were pretty good, because there I am sitting in the dark, watching the lit up stage and the great thing going on. This isn't a rub against theater creators, but when I'm making site specific work, I'm wanting to put people into an environment where they're really not sure what's going to happen. Or maybe they're quite familiar with the host, with the place that the event is occurring, and they're really interested in how us artists are responding to their place of work or their place of worship or their place of healthcare, whatever they're wondering. So the stakes are higher there, right? And you have to kind of go exploring. It's incumbent on you as a audience member to go in and go and try and piece things together, do a bit of detective work, kind of figure out what's going on in this weird space. So, or this space that's been made weird by artists who've come to animate it, right? So yeah, so those things are all kind of very deliberate for me.
Right. So who were your biggest influences that inspired you to pursue theater arts professionally?
Yeah. I think a huge influence for me going back, like the two guys that I met in Brith Gof, Mike Pearson and Cliff McLucas, were a huge inspiration for me. Mike Pearson, similar to me, was a guy who started off university in archaeology, and he was really interested in the traces of ancient cultures, which is what brought him to Wales. He's actually an English guy doing, creating theater in Wales about Welsh history. But and Cliff was really inspiring because he was this architect who got into theater because he had a really interesting idea of what constituted architecture, and how architecture was as interesting for the shapes of buildings and the kind of structures of buildings as it was for the way people use them, and the ephemera, if you like, the traces of people's actions in places was a huge interest to both Cliff and Mike. And they, I guess, like, as a theater director at that point, I learned to become in my master's degree, and someone who was really interested in theater in my undergrad. These guys were just introducing these aspects of my craft of theater that I never thought about before, right? Like when you're staging a work, you never think about the traces of people's movements on the stage as material to delve into, to kind of explore. And Mike Pearson was fascinating to me because he was an English guy working in Wales, and similar to, say, an English speaker working in Quebec, he was always working across the difference of Welsh and English, like different languages. And he created a physical vocabulary for his performers to work in, so they could kind of put aside their differences of language. And that really inspired me, the idea that you could create a kind of body language that could be used as a way of animating narratives, animating stories. And there's ways in which things can be animated through the body that somehow defy language. And this is something that I learned, and I think you'll be familiar with this company as well, with DV8, a physical theater company in London that I was also working with this study. So yeah, maybe Lloyd Newson was another mentor of mine, or a guy who really, he was a guy who came out of modern dance, and he's a beautiful dancer, beautiful choreographer, but someone who really felt like what people should be doing with their bodies on stage should be much, much more than just creating beautiful imagery, which is really what he had learned to do, that he had become a professional doing, was creating beautiful imagery with wonderful, athletic, graceful bodies. As a queer man living in London in the 80s, he had all kinds of political reasons, all kinds of reasons to do with identity, to challenge that use of his medium. And he started to create what was really kind of identified as physical theater, because he was using his performers and choreographing them to create physical narrative that was going way beyond what modern dancers were doing. Even pioneers like Martha Graham, who were telling stories through their body. This was a whole other level of communicating through the body. And furthermore, at that time, if you were a queer man in London in the mid to late 80s, you were living in the so-called plague of the AIDS epidemic. And so he started creating work that was really about addressing this public disaster, right? This homophobic nightmare that the UK was living through, and then ultimately many countries lived through. So I guess these people really inspired me to really think through the potential of what theater and performance can be if you really start to rethink what is a body, what are words, what is space, what is action, how do we take these kind of ingredients of every kind of performance and really rethink what we do with them. So Mike Pearson would say things like, all theater is action happening with more or less time, using more or less space, with greater or lesser intensity. That's everything right there.
That's a nice quote. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome, right? And way that's true. Like you could talk about Kathakali theater in southern India, or Butoh performance in Japan, or naturalistic drama in New York or London, and they all have those qualities the same, right? It's action essentially, whether we're talking words or bodily gesture or whatever. It's happening with more or less space, greater or lesser intensity, with happening in more or less time. So those, kind of, and that actually is kind of like a musical idea too, right? Notation is similar. So when you start to think of your theater work as in that way, then it's really easy to collaborate with people that make music, that compose.
Right.
So that's a sort of interdisciplinary collaboration platform right there, right?
Right. Absolutely. It is. It's just so cool. And all those, you're just touching upon everything when that happens. It's great.
Yeah.
Is there a problem?
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to think that.
Is there a project in particular, such as the Berlin Crossfire / Mama, I think Wichita is pronounced, a part of my pronunciation?
Mama Wichita. Yeah.
Okay.
I could touch on all three of those if you want.
It's up to you. Like, did you have, I was just going to ask you, did you find a project in particular that you had a unique experience working on out of all those?
So, okay, I'll speak briefly about Berlin plus Berlin, because what was interesting about that project is actually it's kind of a failed project, or it's a project that stopped, sadly. So that was a project that we were calling a co-mapping performance.
Okay.
And that was myself collaborating with a Mexican artist who was living in Berlin at the time, Berlin, Germany. Her name is Ilya Knowhere. And Ilya Knowhere is this fascinating, amazing intermedia artist, in that she has a fine art background. She also has a background in gymnastics. She has a background in doing interesting dance. And I met her in Banff in 2002 at a conference at the Banff Center. And I was very happy to meet her because she was so interesting. At that time living in California, but from Mexico. She ended up in Berlin, Germany, because she married a man who taught at a university there. And we'd been chatting on email and phone calls over the years. And then in 2013, I got this opportunity to do a fellowship at a place called ZKU in Berlin, Center for Urban Studies and Artistic Practice in Moabit, which is a interesting suburb of Berlin. It's in an old train depot. It's amazing space. And so I went over there and did this residency and worked with Ilya. And what we were doing in Berlin, Germany, is using various ways that we could create narrative maps, basically. So when mapping becomes a form of storytelling and a form of representing place. And what we were exploring in that project was that I was a complete foreigner to Berlin. That was apart from a quick visit that I had there when I was a teenager. This is kind of like first time that I'd spent any time in Berlin. So I'm an outsider. I'm an Auslander, a foreigner. And she had lived there for a couple of years at that point, but was still kind of new to the place. And we did various exercises where we would narrate and represent our experiences of Berlin based on different neighborhoods, based on different parts of the city. And we would do this process in such a way that we were in a kind of creative conversation about place that included our disagreements about what we were perceiving. So, for example, we did an exercise where we would walk together for maybe a 4-kilometer walk. And every, say, 20 steps, she would take a photograph and I would take a photograph. So we were in the same place, but because we're different people, we would look at different things. And so, and we would do that, and then we would put that together as the kind of, if you like, the visual map of our journey together. So what we were kind of exploring there, I think, is what's the texture, what's the feeling of collaboration, close collaboration. We were exploring really our relationship in this place. And our intention was to bring that work back to Kitchener, Ontario, also used to be called Berlin, right? That's the Berlin plus Berlin part. But it was interesting at the end of a 2-month process that we did in Berlin, Germany. Ilya and I, through various reasons, through various tensions about the work we were doing, we got to a point really where we were like antagonistic to a point where it was getting harder and harder to work together. And I don't know, I'm trying my best to describe it. But there was just a sort of tension. And we put off doing the second stage of the work. But maybe it will happen, you know, because also a thing that we were interested is time in this work, so duration. So maybe what we need now is just 10 years apart before we continue that work. And then, you know, the second stage of it would happen in a different place, but also in a very different time. And we would be we would be 10 years older. So we'd be different people.
Yes.
And, you know, this work was really drilling down on all of that, right? Like it was drilling down on, you know, how did this place feel in your body? Did it, you know, did you have knee pain? Did it give you a headache? What were you dreaming? Like there was a close attention to all kinds of minutiae of how space was affecting you and affecting your definition of what it was as a place. And I went through a period in that 2 months in Berlin where my German is rough enough that I went, and Moabit is a fairly German-speaking part of Berlin, unlike, say, Kreuzberg, where they speak a lot of Turkish and English, or Mitte, some of these like really cool places in what used to be Eastern Germany, where everyone speaks English. In Moabit, not so much. So I went through this process of feeling really alienated by language, and I tried to incorporate that into the work as much as possible, but that was a point of tension, for example. So so that was Berlin. By contrast, a cross-firing Mama We Toten, which is a project that happened in 2006 at a place called Claybank in Saskatchewan. That was a large-scale site-specific performance, not unlike the Weyburn project. And it happened in a place that is actually a World UNESCO site. I understand Claybank has achieved that status because it's a brick plant in southern Saskatchewan that has these amazing kiln, beehive type kilns where they used to fire up the clay to make bricks. And that structure, the kiln structure, goes back to the Roman period. Like, it's an ancient way of building a kiln. And there was about half a dozen of them on that site. And this is a brick factory made by European settlers who came to that part of southern Saskatchewan. It's an area called the Dirt Hills, south of Moose Jaw.
Okay.
And that area, the clay is really special. And the geological explanation is, when the glaciers retreated north across North America, in that part of North America, it was like the ice was digging really deep, and it filled up this amazing clay that usually would be, 500 meters under the surface. It was pulled up to the surface, and it has these very special mineral qualities to it. And when settlers came out to that part of Saskatchewan in the early 20th century, 1900 to 1905, they found this clay because they were doing all kinds of testing to figure out, can you build on it? What kind of place would this be to make a settlement and so on? And there was a guy who discovered that this clay was really special because he had some experience in clay firing. Like, bricks are made the way pottery is made, right? You put it into a kiln and you heat it at a great, great heat, and then it turns into this amazing building material. So they tested this clay back in the UK, in England, and they determined that it was a remarkable clay for brick making. So remarkable, in fact, that they use clay bricks from that area to build the blast chambers at Cape Canaveral and Cape Kennedy down in the United States. There's something about that brick that makes it extraordinarily fire resistant. And there's something about when you put it in the kiln, when you fire it, that's the phrase, it brings out this amazing luster. So the bricks from Claybank were used to make some pretty amazing buildings in Canada. Many of those fancy hotels that we have across Canada, the Chateau Frontenac or the Bessborough Hotel in Saskatoon, or the Queen, I think it's the Queen Elizabeth, whatever the fancy CP hotel, or it used to be CP Hotel in Victoria, they have this Claybank brick in it. So do a bunch of government buildings. It's a beautiful brick. It has a kind of golden luster to it with little flecks in it. So very, very valuable resource, right? So that became this brick manufacturing company until the late 80s, when through NAFTA, through free trade, it was discovered that you can just get really great bricks from Mexico. And they're much cheaper. So the business was put out of, they were basically put out of business. And the purpose for us going to that site, this was a company I was with in Saskatchewan called Knowhere Productions, was to animate the history of this space from the resource of clay, right? Sort of beginning with that resource, we were trying to understand this space and how it became this special place of brick making. And then we worked with a group called Sagayawak in Regina. Sagayawak is an Indigenous art collective. We collaborated with them, and they came in looking at the site as well, but understanding that resource from a completely different point of view. Because for Indigenous people on the prairies, clay is sacred. It has medicinal qualities, it has spiritual qualities, and that area of the Dirt Hills is where there's a lot of medicine wheels. It's where there's a lot of burial ceremonies that happen. It's like a temple for Indigenous people. So in that show, Crossfiring and Mama Witoten, we used the word crossfiring because we wanted people to think about the transformation that happens when clay is heated to such an extent that it becomes a hard brick, right? And there's something in that we thought was a really rich metaphor for the way Europeans do things, right? We take raw materials, we heat them, we heat the hell out of them, and then they become hard, and then they become our cities, you know, then they become our institutions, right? There's a really rich metaphor there about European imperial expansion.
Right.
And then the indigenous points of view about clay are, like, I'll give you this one story. So one thing that they do, and I think it was the Slavey indigenous nation, is when someone would die, they would take the clay and make a kind of coffin out of the clay. And when they did that process, they made sure that they were doing that with lots of children around, and the children were involved in making the coffin, because in their faith, the voices, the laughter, the energy of children get absorbed in the clay. And that would be about sending that laughter, that childish energy into the next world with the person who had just passed away. So they had, you know, like, this is the story of the different, if you like, the tension between Europeans and indigenous people in Canada, is that they think of the land in a very, very different way than we do. Like, I'm a settler, right? So I can claim that. My ancestry came over here and thought, how do we buy this, right? How do we take this? How do we develop it? Our agriculture, our settlements, how do we make money off of this? That kind of thing, right? We think of it as a resource in that way. Whereas indigenous people think of land as part of an interconnected ecology that is deeply connected to their ontology, to their way of being, to their spirituality, to the, you know. So I had a Cree indigenous person that I worked with once who told me that the word for land is similar to the word for mother in Cree. So when Europeans would come and talk about buying the land, it's sort of like an obscene proposition to a Cree person, right? Because it's like, what? Why are you talking about buying my mother, right? It's awful. So we, in that show, tried to explore the tensions in the resource, which in this case was clay, and how it did create these beautiful buildings that have become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. but they also, you know, they also represent an action of colonization that occurred in that part of Saskatchewan that had negative effects on the indigenous populations. And one thing about indigenous people on the prairie is they were nomadic. So for them, it was just like they would follow the bison. So it's sort of a weird thing for anyone to settle in the prairies, because in their philosophy, it was important to keep moving. And that's why, you know, when Winnipeg floods every spring, right, because of the Assiniboine and the Red Rivers, indigenous people kind of laugh at that, because they said, well, you know, if you were moving, you wouldn't be caught where the flooding is. Like, or I lived in Regina, which has a indigenous name, which is Wascana. Wascana translates to, you know, pile of bones, or, you know, the dump, basically, like the place where, because it was a swamp. And then we went in there with European technology and we drained the swamp and created the city. But in their mind, it was like a terrible place to put a settlement. So my experience in the prairies working with indigenous people was really about kind of understanding, you know, these cultural tensions. I'll use the phrase of Jean-Francois Lyotard, the difference, which literally means bad translation from one to the other, and how that could become really interesting material for creating a performance. So that's what Mama Witoten was about. So if you look at the two projects, Berlin, Crossfiring Mama Witoten, I'm interested in tensions. Yeah, and really conflict. It's the spirit of theater, right? like conflict, tension, that's what makes it interesting, right? And I guess maybe what I would expect. Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear you. Say again.
I think that's what makes it interesting, the tensions and the conflicts.
Yeah. And I think maybe where my work is going now is to be even more pronounced in the way that I am creating work in what I'm calling sites of contestation. So,
Okay.
which really means every place you can think of in Canada, right? It is
Right.
really a site where there's a contested idea of what that place is, right? So
Right.
I'm in my basement in Kitchener, Ontario, which is on the Haldimand Tract, which was land promised to the Six Nations back in 1760 something, or 1780, sorry, 1780. And it was land that was promised to Six Nations because of the work they did helping to keep the Americans from invading this north shore of Lake Erie. And at that time, the Governor General Haldimand, he gave them this parcel of land, 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River from mouth to source. And then that land has slowly been taken back, stolen really from Six Nations people. So I'm on stolen land. And I guess I never forget that, right? That's all. And I did a project called Different, the Caledonia project with students about that. So I guess now that I can never really look at the place that I'm living the same after I have that knowledge. And I think that's true of pretty well everywhere you could go in Canada, right? There's these layers of what a place is, and I'm determined to make work that kind of explores those layers.
Right, absolutely. And what was your experience like working in Germany and receiving the, so again, pronunciation, ZKU Center of Art and Urbanistic Centrum für Kunst and Urbanistic Fellowship? I think that's in German, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
It's pretty good. Yeah, so Kunst in German is art, right? So whenever you were making weird projects in public in Germany, if, say, a security person came up to you or a police person, you could just say Kunstwerk, and then they would go, okay, you're making art. I'll leave you to it. Imagine doing that in Canada, right? Anyway, so yeah, so ZKU, that was great. So I was there for a few months in 2013. I was there in this fellowship, and I worked with Ilya Noe during that time. And yeah, that was a great. The thing about Berlin, I'll say, is Berlin is a very young, vibrant place. Maybe the equivalent in Canada is Montreal, and I say that because Berlin was this island of Western presence when we used to have the East Germany as a communist authoritarian entity, and the USSR. So I don't know if you're familiar with this history, but in 1963, President Kennedy, then the President of the United States of America, he went to Berlin, which was this funny little island. Like West Berlin had basically a big fence and a wall around it to keep it separate from Eastern Germany, which was all around. And he made a speech where the famous phrase is ich bin ein Berliner, right? He claimed that he was a Berliner because as an American in pursuit of freedom, he claimed that Berliners were like the pinnacle of that pursuit of freedom, right? And yeah, so Berlin has this interesting territory to it that makes it different from the rest of Germany. So in Berlin, you know, if you go to other parts of Germany, you go to Munich, say, they're really like nailed down. They're really precise. There's something about German culture that's really about, you know, the trains running on time and everything is done in a very kind of particular way. Berlin is a real like space of bizarre experimentation. It's more multicultural than other parts of Germany, so it's got this interesting, you know, bohemian sort of feel to it. And Berliners
Ooh.
like to think of themselves as different from the rest of Germany. So they're, you know, they really are this little island, even though that, you know, Eastern Germany no longer exists. When the wall came down, everything changed, but there's still a culture, a kind of perception there among Berliners that they're different. And that's similar to Montreal, right? In the way that Montreal is often quite different from the rest of Quebec. It's much more tolerant towards allophones, right? People that don't speak French or English. It's much more, it's an island, literally, in the St. Lawrence. It's a place of artistic experimentation. Oh, and maybe the last thing I'll say is both places had artificially low rent because Berlin, in its separate state, didn't have the same kind of economy as the rest of Germany. So rent prices for the longest time were really low there. And Montreal has benefited from that because, you know, the big head offices of banks and huge Canadian corporations left Montreal back in the early 80s because they were worried that Quebec was going to separate.
Okay.
And the separatist government in the province at the time was like, you know, screw the allophones, like screw the anglophones. Like it was like they really pushed English speaking business out. So that's why Montreal became a really cheap city to live in. And for many decades, it was the cheapest, like, big city to live in Canada. That's slowly changing now. But anyway, Berlin and Montreal, similar. So I wanted to go there because I was really excited about that atmosphere. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot there. I met at ZKU, this center that I worked at. I worked with artists from around the world. Some really great people that I met there, and it was a great space to exchange thinking about practice and thinking about how we were doing our work. And most of the artists there were thinking about urban environments. I'm a bit of a standout there because I also work in pretty rural places, and I'm sort of just as interested in that. But anyway, there you go. That's what ZKU is.
All right. Are there any research papers you found exceptionally difficult to write about?
It's interesting that you asked that.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with two papers right now that I've been struggling with for a while. Funnily enough, both of them are papers that I'm writing with other people. One of them is about a project that we did that I did in 2012. 2014, called From Solitary to Solidarity: Unraveling the Ligatures of Ashley Smith. Okay. So I don't know if that name rings a bell. Ashley Smith was a woman who was in her late teens. She was 18 when she took her own life. And she did that in the Grand Valley Institute for Women. It's the prison for women in South Kitchener.
Okay.
And Ashley Smith was this interesting, provocative young person who was first incarcerated when she was 15 in New Brunswick. And, you know, it would later be revealed that she had fairly significant mental health issues. So she was struggling with her mental health management, I'll put it that way. And in the way that she struggled, she would act out against authority. She was quite a provocative person. And Canada Corrections, which is the name we call our prison system, instead of dealing with her mental health or dealing with her in an appropriate way, they just kept moving her from institution to institution to institution. So it was like they kept passing her along, or not dealing with her, but kind of denying her problems and just sending her to another prison. So in 2 years, I think it was, she went to 18 different, she had 18 different moves to different prisons across Canada. And she ended up in Grand Valley Institute. And at that point, she was in a serious state of distress. And she managed to find a way to strangle herself with fibers from her apparently her suicide gown, which is like a special outfit she was wearing to prevent her from doing that kind of thing.
Oh my gosh.
And she was so provocative to her guards that they sort of watched her kill herself. Like, they didn't intervene. They'd been told not to.
Oh my gosh.
So this is a really disturbing story. I found out about it through Hannah Gartner's really good investigative journalism on CBC, the Fifth Estate.
Mm-hmm.
She did a really great journalistic piece about the death of Ashley Smith. And as it turns out, Canada Corrections was charged for her murder. Ultimately, this is around the time that we were making this work. A manslaughter charge was laid. They were found guilty. So there's been some justice in her case. But I took this really disturbing story because it really affected me. At the time, I had 2 teenage sons. Mm-hmm. And that's the summer when we started working on this project. One of them had a particularly hard time. I guess had some mental health issues, had gotten in trouble with the police.
Right.
So it was a really close situation to me personally. Mm-hmm. And then I went and worked with a group of students in the fall, and then we staged this in the winter. It was it's a performance that I'm very, very proud of. And I'm trying to write about it for this journal I mentioned way back at the beginning of this interview, the TDR, for Richard Schechner, who's the editor of that journal. Mm-hmm. And I had been writing the paper with a guy called Stephen Fernandez, who was involved with creating an interactive media space in the gallery outside the theater. Mm-hmm. And we were coming at our contributions to this whole project in different ways. And I think now I'm going to go and just tell the story on my own. Mm-hmm. So maybe similar to the story I told you about Berlin post Berlin. Right. Every now and then, sometimes you can be doing collaborative work with people and you realize there's a point at which maybe it's just not going to create a thing that you thought it was going to create. It creates something else maybe. And so I'm struggling with that one. And then the other paper I'm struggling with right now is a paper on another student project, a project I did with Waterloo students called Unconscious Curriculum. Okay. And that was another difficult show to do because it's about rape culture on campus. Mm-hmm. So I'm co-writing that with Brooke Barnes, a recently graduated student who was involved in the project. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's tricky to do these papers maybe because they are delving into very personal, traumatic events that have touched me in such a way that it's sometimes hard to revisit. But I think it's important that we do that. I think it's important to do this work so we figure out ultimately how we relate to difficult things. Right. And I do think that trauma can be, when you approach it in the right way, there's huge benefits that come from going through traumatic events and coming out the other side with a kind of experience of that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is like a tough work and definitely very hard for sure.
Yeah.
You've established a lab called the Sensorium Suite. What is the story behind this facility and what is its mission?
Yeah, so the Sensorium Suite goes back to earlier thoughts and passions that I've had. When I say earlier, kind of around the time that I came to the University of Waterloo in 2002.
Okay.
The lab was really a way of getting funding to buy equipment that would really allow for a full investigation of a space through sound, through imagery, through video, through all kinds of means of representation.
Right.
And the sensorium was a wonderful concept for me because it really was posing important questions about how we engage with the world through our senses.
Mm-hmm.
So we do, of course, create discourse. We write things down. We speak about things. We try to form a logical kind of way of representing what we feel.
Mm-hmm.
But the sensorium is also trying to capture the kind of a priori experience of phenomena.
Oh.
And that could be visual, that could be, it's through the senses, that could be how we touch, haptics, could be how we feel things go through our body kinesthetically, could be how things smell, could be how things sound, of course. And so the sensorium suite is kind of a lab to explore these elements that we want to address in creating performance that maybe are underrepresented in more conventional work. And, you know, one way of putting that is if we think about discourse, which is kind of the way we, you know, we make arguments and we do things at the university, right? I make an argument, I write a paper, I convince people of my point of view or my way of doing something. But discourse is always, I think, in a kind of conversation or sits alongside what might be called a figural presence. And the figural presence is really all of those things that discourse addresses but can't quite comprehend or can't quite contain.
Okay.
And figurality is like what you feel in your body when you're thinking it and articulating. It's what you feel in relation to others. It's these perceptual energies that are an absolutely important part of anyone doing any creative thing, but are so resistant to being captured by our discourse. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Okay. So the sensorium was a way of trying to append or apprehend, or a way of trying to acknowledge this figural quality in the creative work that I'm doing. I
see. It sounds like a beautiful facility and with a great mission.
Cool. I'm glad you think that. And really it's just, at one point it contained a lot of sound and video and other kinds of equipment that went around in road cases, like the kind of thing you see rock bands, moving around when they do a concert.
Right.
And because the technology has evolved, now I can fit pretty much all of the sensorium suite inside a duffel bag. So there you go. It's very portable.
All right. Very, very handy that way. What was your experience like working for the Canadian Theatre Review?
Oh, wow. The CTR. Yeah. So I was the reviews and views editor of the CTR for about 8 years. What was lovely about that, I was welcomed to the Canadian Theatre Review by a former professor of mine, Harry Lane. He used to work at the University of Guelph. A lovely group of people who welcomed me to that journal. And what was really great about doing that, Thara, was that the Canadian Theatre Review is a journal that is what we call a crossover journal. So it works as much to publish the thoughts and understandings of professional practitioners as it does to publish the thoughts and expression of scholars. So it was lovely to be in this kind of journalistic space that's between the profession and academia. And it was great. I learned a lot about what people were doing across Canada, because the views and reviews editor meant that I was hearing about projects happening across the country, and projects by Canadians happening internationally. And I was lucky enough to do a special edition in the CTR on site-specific performance, and also theater and the question of disability, which was a really wonderful, eye-opening experience. Was learning about all the various wonderful practitioners in Canada that are practicing, disability arts, or what, we were really questioning the word disability as a modifier for these artists in that journal. So in that particular issue, so that was a real great learning experience for me. I co-edited that issue with a woman called Michelle de Cockney, who's based in Alberta, and she's an amazing advocate for disability arts, for people who in various ways live with various disabilities and practice as professional artists. So my time with the Canadian Theatre Review was this wonderful introduction to some really great work happening in Canada from coast to coast to coast. So it made me very proud of our country and not so big but very diverse community of theater practitioners that live here.
Right, absolutely. Are there any collaborative projects you look forward to implementing in the near future?
Yeah, so I'm quite excited about an initiative that has been given life during the pandemic called the WOOM Collaborative. So that's WOOM in capitals, and then collaborative in small case letters. WOOM, I'm hoping, will serve as a kind of creative platform for young artists in the region of Waterloo and maybe beyond, but for now, the region of Waterloo, who have graduated from Waterloo or Laurier or Guelph, say any of the local post-secondary education institutions. They want to work in a collaborative environment where they can receive mentorship and some resources and some collaborative input on projects that they want to create that are performance related, that are sort of intermedia works. Maybe site responsive or site specific, but not necessarily. I think it's really important to create this platform because I do see a lot of really great students come through our program and they graduate, and there's different avenues that they can pursue. There's a graduate degree they could go to, or they could go to the National Theatre School to hone particular skills that they want to work on, or they work in the profession. All of those destinations or journeys that they would take after a BA in theater and performance require the development of a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of credential. And I'm hoping that WOOM will give young artists trying to establish themselves and the next steps in their career with an opportunity to create new and original work. And there's two projects that are on the go right now. One is called Mall of Maladaptive Dreaming.
Okay.
And it's a performance that addresses the stories, the dreams, the maladaptive dreams of a retail worker who lives in Waterloo. Her name is Carly Ann Dadarian, and she was a theater student at Waterloo, and she's a fight choreographer. She's done various she's played various performance roles upon graduation, but for socioeconomic reasons, she falls back on her day job, which is being a manager in a women's clothing store at Conestoga Mall.
Oh, I see.
And she started keeping a journal about her retail life. And one of the characteristics of the journal is that she has the capacity or the propensity to daydream during her job.
Yeah.
It's been diagnosed as maladaptive daydreaming.
Oh.
And when she wanted to start working with me, we worked out various ways of how this project might become a performance. And one thing that I was really struck by in her descriptions of her perception of work was how haunted everything feels. So it's like she's seeing ghosts in the way that she dreams, like daydreams. And so we initially thought this might be a performance that happens in an old place. Like, well, we were thinking of the Homer Watson House down in Kitchener, which is an arts center that's kind of notorious for being haunted, and it's notorious for Homer Watson's love of the spiritual realm. So he was a businessman who was a hobbyist as a painter in the early 20th century, and he was quite involved in the spiritualism movement at that time, which was basically people that were really like ghost hunters, right? They were interested in ghosts. We do seances there. It's a really fun place. But we decided instead to put it in the mall because the mall is really where this happens for Carly-Ann. And we are staging it in the shops at Uptown Waterloo because I don't know if you've been to that mall recently, but it's a wonderful, beautifully appointed shopping space that was renovated about 10 years ago to become an even nicer kind of she shopping environment.
Wow.
But even before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated this. Almost every shop is empty. I think just because everyone's just buying things online now, or just no one thinks to go in there.
Yeah.
So it's literally like this void. It's like this. It's like a haunted place because it's really just a framework of the memory of what it once was. So we found our haunted house. It just happens to be a mall, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're creating this performance there. We hope that it'll happen in the late spring, early summer of 2022. It's been delayed because of the pandemic.
Yeah, everything is kind of pushed back because of the pandemic. I was just thinking the only thing that I can relate to with the maladaptive daydreaming about the retail work is that I too worked in Conestoga Mall in retail, so that's the one connection that I have there. But other than that, it's all new.
Wow, what did you do when you were you said Conestoga, is that right?
Yeah, Conestoga Mall. Yeah, I was working in a clothing store as a sales associate.
Okay, wow. So yeah. Carly-Ann works at a place called Bikini Village.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I worked in a Gap.
So what's interesting about Bikini Village is how weird it is as a place of retail, because bathing suits are this very gendered, very, particular kind of clothing. Yeah. And it's rich in terms of how there's a lot of tension around it, right? Like we love it, we hate it, people are bothered about it. There's people like, basically she's almost like a therapist when she works with people who have troubling issues with their body, and they're trying to get an outfit really that they can go on vacation in. And so it's a really rich. So I would encourage you, Thora, to create a play about working at the Gap too.
Absolutely. Hopefully I can do that. I don't know if it'll be successful, but I'll give it my best shot.
Think of it, right? The Gap, right? Just fill it. What's in the Gap?
Yeah. What's in the Gap? That's a good one. I like it. Yeah. What is your message to all the youth and young adults who wish to pursue a career in intermedia and site-specific theater?
Be daring. Go for it. If you find, okay, so what I would say quite earnestly, quite simply is, don't be afraid to pursue your passions. And I say that as a father and as an instructor, as a professor, as an artist, someone who might work with you someday. Yeah. It's not easy. It's there's always going to be good reasons to give up and to do something that your parents want you to do, or to do something that is a more obvious career choice. So I would say that, like, don't be fooled by, or don't be discouraged by the overwhelming challenges of imagining to make a living as an artist, but rather be really attentive to the day-to-day and how you can connect with other people, and that other people will probably want to go on that journey with you. So pay close attention to relationships, nurture them, invest in them, maintain them. And that's going to give you a rich life regardless of what you do. But also, the idea of doing something like site responsive work or site specific work, or I'll focus on that, is you can sometimes then talk about performance creation, theater creation, as it relates to things that relate to everybody, which is to say, we all live in some kind of building. We all go to school in some kind of building. We all go to work in some kind of building. All of those sites are potential places in the sense that they accrue all kinds of meanings. They develop meanings over time. We tell stories about them. We hold them in our memories and our dreams and our nightmares and our hearts, I guess you could say. And so the kind of work that I do is it's easy to be able to say to other people, well, this is really important because it's about animating or telling a story about that historical place, or about that place that's significant to you and your friends because you went to school there, or you worked there, or you used to go there and hang out when you were a kid, or you go there and hang out now. It's about acknowledging our built environment. So what I'm suggesting is, in order to make theater, you try and find a way to connect what you're doing in theater to other things like architecture, archaeology, history, economics. You find these connections. In the same way that you're looking for connections with friends, you're looking for connections between what you do and other things that people are deeply passionate about. And maybe I would just say, like, have the patience of a farmer. Farmers, they have a tough time growing things sometimes. They have to work with nature, which is hard to predict. They have to work in conditions that are sometimes really physically and emotionally and psychologically difficult. But they hang in there because there's something of their heart in what they're doing, and they're creating things that nourish us. So think of yourself in creating art as doing something that's got a noble purpose like that. And if you need to take up other jobs, I've done that. There's ways to pay the rent. There's ways to put food on the table, but try to keep some part of yourself active in making theater, making performance.
Absolutely.
So I guess, and then maybe what I'm trying to say overall, and I'll stop talking now, is
okay.
Amazing. Imagine that. So the journey that you can go on will be, it's not a straight line. It will be complicated, and it'll have ups and downs, and that's what makes it so interesting. Do not expect that you'll go, if you follow a route similar to mine, you're not going to go directly from an undergrad to a graduate to a postdoc or to whatever. Like, it's not, the trajectory of a line is dull, and it doesn't even really exist. So it's cool to have setbacks. It's cool to find your life going in an opposite direction from what you expected. Just go with it and absorb it and use it in the work that you make. and you'll make good work.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful message. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andy.
Yeah, great. Now, this has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew Houston, Professor Andrew Houston, for being here with us today and expanding on your art and your career, your profession. It was so enlightening. Next week on Limelight on Thursday, stay tuned, everyone. We'll have our next guest, and I can't wait. Thank you, and have a great weekend.